14 girls went to summer camp in 1990 to find God. Instead, they found something that wore his face and spoke in scripture, while it stole their names, their bodies, and their lives. For 34 years, their sleeping bags lay buried beneath the chapel floor in a concrete tomb waiting for someone to ask the right questions. When Detective Sarah Chen saw that purple sleeping bag with silver stars, she knew one of those questions was why didn't anyone look for her sister hard enough? Some prayers go unanswered. Some don't deserve to be heard. Before we start, hit subscribe to help uncover stories they tried to bury and make sure no name stays forgotten. The fog had settled thick over Clearwater County, like guilt that refused to dissipate, clinging to the abandoned foundations of Camp Galilee, where luxury condos were supposed to rise from ground that had never been consecrated, only cursed. Detective Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the construction site, watching steam rise from her coffee while the excavator operator's face had gone white as communion wafers. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice thin as confession, "you need to see what we found under the chapel." Sarah walked slowly across the churned earth, her boots sinking into mud that smelled of decay and old secret. The construction crew had gathered in a tight circle around what looked like a concrete vault the size of a small room. Someone had broken through the seal, and the air that escaped carried the scent of mildew and something else, something that made her stomach turn. The foreman, a man named Rodriguez, met her at the edge of the opening. "We were laying foundation for Building 3 when the excavator hit this," he said, pointing down into the hole. "Sealed tight for decades by the look of it. But, detective, when you see what's inside, you're going to want to call this in as a crime scene." Sarah peered into the vault, and her breath caught in her throat. 14 sleeping bags lay arranged in a perfect circle, each one positioned like a spoke in a wheel. They were faded, but intact, preserved by the sealed environment. Pink ones, blue ones, and there in the far corner a purple sleeping bag with silver stars that made her knees go weak. She pulled out her phone and dialed the state crime lab, trying to keep her voice steady as she requested a full forensics team. Then she called the sheriff and told him to clear his schedule because Camp Galilee was about to become the biggest case Clearwater County had ever seen. While they waited for backup, Sarah studied the scene from above. Each sleeping bag contained what looked like personal belongings, a Bible, a small suitcase, and items that had been carefully preserved. The concrete chamber had been built to last, designed to keep its contents safe from time and weather. Someone had wanted these things found eventually. Sheriff Martinez arrived 20 minutes later, followed by 2 state investigators and a forensics van. Sarah watched them descend into the chamber with cameras and evidence bags, trying not to think about the purple sleeping bag that looked exactly like the one her 14-year-old sister Jenny had packed for camp 34 years ago. One of the forensics techs called up from below. "Detective Chen, you need to see this. Each sleeping bag has a nameplate attached. They're not the names of the missing girls, though. These are different names." Sarah climbed down into the chamber, her flashlight beam sweeping across the circle of bags. The nameplates were made of brass, tarnished but still readable. Dove, silence, grace, obedience, charity. Names that sounded like virtues but felt like violations. She approached the purple sleeping bag with trembling hands. The nameplate read, "Purity," but Sarah knew this bag belonged to Jenny Chen, who had been excited about learning archery and making friendship bracelets and growing closer to God during her week at camp. Jenny, who had hugged their mother goodbye and promised to write every day. Jenny, who had never come home. Inside the sleeping bag, they found Jenny's clothes, neatly folded her diary with entries that stopped abruptly on July 15th, and a photograph that made Sarah's blood run cold. It showed Jenny and 13 other girls standing in a line wearing white robes, their faces blank and empty, like they were sleepwalking through a nightmare. Detective Martinez called from across the chamber. "Sarah, we found something else. Built into the wall, there's a sealed box." The box was metal about the size of a shoebox and locked with a combination that had been scratched into the concrete beside it. Inside, they found video cassettes labeled with dates from July 1990 and a handwritten journal that began with the words, "The chosen have been prepared for their holy purpose." Sarah felt the chamber walls closing in around her as she realized what they had discovered. This wasn't just a burial site, it was a record. Someone had documented everything that happened to those 14 girls and had preserved the evidence like trophies. They're going to need heavy equipment to get everything out safely, Sheriff Martinez said. But his voice sounded far away to Sarah, who was staring at the photograph of her sister's empty eyes. As the forensics team worked, Sarah climbed out of the chamber and walked to the edge of the construction site where the old chapel foundation was still visible through the weeds. Camp Galilee had been a place where families sent their daughters to grow in faith and fellowship. Parents had trusted the church leaders with their most precious gifts. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was simple, but it made her hands shake. I saw the news about Camp Galilee. I was there. I survived. My name is Rachel Morrison, and I've been waiting 34 years to tell someone what really happened to those girls. Sarah stared at the message, feeling something crack open in her chest. After 34 years of silence, someone was finally ready to speak. But as she looked back at the concrete tomb, where her sister's sleeping bag lay surrounded by evidence of unspeakable crimes, she wondered if the truth would bring justice or just more pain. The fog was lifting from Clearwater County, but Sarah knew that some shadows would take much longer to disappear. Rachel Morrison sat in the coffee shop on the edge of Clearwater County with hands that wouldn't stop shaking around her mug. She had driven 3 hours from the city where she worked as a licensed social worker specializing in trafficking survivors, but she had never told any of her clients that she understood their trauma from the inside. Now at 49 years old, she was finally ready to speak the words that had been burning in her throat for 34 years. Detective Sarah Chen walked through the door at exactly 2 o'clock as they had arranged. Rachel recognized her immediately, not from any photo, but from the way she moved like someone carrying invisible weight. When Sarah sat down across from her, Rachel saw her own haunted expression reflected in the detective's eyes. "You said you survived Camp Galilee," Sarah said quietly. Her voice was steady, but Rachel caught the tremor underneath. "I was 15, Rachel replied. "Old enough to understand what was happening, but too young to know how to stop it. I was there when they took the other girls. I was there when they gave us new names and told us we were chosen for God's special work." Sarah leaned forward, her notebook already open. "Tell me about the camp. What did it look like from the inside?" Rachel closed her eyes and let herself remember. Camp Galilee was beautiful on the surface, cabins arranged around a central chapel with a lake view that made you think God really was watching. Reverend Thomas Bright ran the camp with his son David, who worked as a counselor. They preached about spiritual purity and divine calling. Parents thought they were sending their daughters to become better Christians. "What changed?" Sarah asked. Everything Rachel said. On the 3rd day, they separated us into 2 groups. The younger girls stayed in the regular program, but 14 of us were told we had been chosen for advanced spiritual training. They moved us to a different cabin complex hidden deeper in the woods. That's where the real indoctrination began. Sarah's pen had stopped moving. Indoctrination into what? They called it the Ministry of Sacred Vessels. Rachel said the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Reverend Bright told us that God had chosen us to serve a higher purpose, that our bodies were temples that needed to be consecrated for holy work. He used Scripture to justify everything, to make us believe that resistance was sin. She pulled a worn photograph from her purse and slid it across the table. It showed the same group of girls from Jenny's photograph, but this one was taken earlier. They were smiling, excited about their adventure. Rachel pointed to a girl with dark hair in the back row. "That's me," she said. "Before they took our names, before they made us wear white robes and told us that speaking was a privilege we had to earn, before they started the ceremonies." "What kind of ceremonies?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Purification rituals," Rachel said. "They would film everything for what they called documentation of our spiritual progress. Reverend Bright said the videos were proof of our transformation, But I think now they were something else, evidence or blackmail or just trophies for sick men who used God as cover for their crimes. Sarah thought about the video cassettes they had found in the sealed box. How many girls were in your group originally? 18, Rachel said. But 4 were sent home early. Their families were too connected, too likely to ask questions. The 14 who stayed were chosen because we were vulnerable. Foster kids. Girls from broken homes, children whose parents were too grateful for spiritual guidance to look too closely at what guidance meant. What happened to the others? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer would destroy her. Rachel was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the grey October sky. They were moved, she said finally. Reverend Bright had connections, other camps, other ministries. Some girls were sent to what he called international missions. Others just disappeared completely. The lucky ones died quickly. And you? Sarah whispered. I was selected for transfer too, Rachel said. On July 20th, we were loaded into vans for what they called our next phase of service. I was in the second van with 3 other girls. The driver was going too fast on the mountain road and hit a deer. The van rolled, and I was thrown clear. The others, Rachel's voice broke. The others didn't make it. Sarah reached across the table and covered Rachel's hand with her own. How did you survive after that? Head injury, Rachel said. Amnesia that lasted for months. When I finally remembered enough to tell someone what had happened, the camp was already closed. The official story was that 18 girls had run away from an overly strict religious program. No one wanted to investigate further. No one wanted to believe that men of God could do such things. Sarah pulled out the photograph they had found in Jenny's sleeping bag. Is this from one of their ceremonies? Rachel looked at the image of 14 girls in white robes, their faces empty and lost. Yes, she said. That was taken the night before the transfers. They made us pose like we were angels, but we felt like we were already dead. Do you know where Reverend Bright is now? Sarah asked. Dead, Rachel said. Heart attack in 1995, but his son David is still alive. He was there for everything. He helped with the selections, the ceremonies, the transfers. Last I heard, he was working for Child Protective Services in Oregon. Sarah felt her blood turn cold. A man who had participated in trafficking children was now working in the system meant to protect them. There's something else, Rachel said. The chamber where you found the sleeping bags, that wasn't random. Reverend Bright always said that if anything happened to the ministry, he would preserve our memory. I think he buried those things as insurance, or maybe as a shrine to what he had accomplished. Sarah looked at the woman across from her who had survived hell and spent her adult life trying to save other children from the same fate. Why are you telling me this now? She asked. Because Rachel said your sister Jenny was my roommate at the camp. She was kind to me when kindness was dangerous. She shared her food when we were being starved for disobedience. She held my hand during the worst ceremonies and whispered that we would survive this together. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. I kept that promise for 34 years, Detective Chen. I survived, but I never forgot the girls who didn't make it out with me. When I saw the news about the sleeping bags, I knew it was time to honor their memory by telling the truth. David Bright answered his phone on the 3rd ring with the careful, professional tone of someone who had spent years hiding in plain sight. Detective Sarah Chen identified herself and heard the sharp intake of breath that told her everything she needed to know before she even asked her first question. Mr. Bright, I'm calling about Camp Galilee, she said. We found some things that suggest you might have information about what happened there in 1990. The silence stretched so long Sarah thought he might have hung up. Then his voice came back smaller than before. I wondered when someone would finally call, he said. I've been waiting 34 years for this conversation. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. We need to talk in person. Can you come to Clearwater County, or do we need to come to you? I'll drive down, David said. I owe those girls that much. Give me 2 days to arrange coverage at work and I'll tell you everything I should have told someone decades ago. After she hung up, Sarah sat in her truck outside the coffee shop, staring at Rachel Morrison through the window. Rachel had agreed to stay in town to help with the investigation, to be the voice for girls who could no longer speak for themselves. But Sarah could see the cost written in the tight lines around her eyes, the way she held herself like someone expecting another blow. Back at the station, the forensics team had finished cataloguing the contents of the sleeping bags. Each one told a story of interrupted childhood. Jenny's bag contained her diary, with entries about learning to braid friendship bracelets and her excitement about the camp talent show. Another bag held a half-finished letter home that said, "Mama, I love it here so much I wish I could stay forever." The cruelest irony was that the writer had gotten her wish. Sheriff Martinez found Sarah in the evidence room holding Jenny's diary. "The state lab rushed the video analysis," he said. "You're not going to like what they found." The videos were worse than Sarah had imagined. They showed the progression from normal camp activities to something that twisted religion into a weapon of control. Reverend Bright appeared in most of them, a tall man with kind eyes that held no warmth, speaking to the girls about their special calling, their need to submit to God's will through his guidance. In one video, Jenny sat in a circle with the other chosen girls while Bright explained that their families had sent them here because they were troubled children who needed a spiritual correction. He told them their parents had signed papers giving the camp full authority over their rehabilitation. Sarah knew this was a lie, but she could see how 14 vulnerable girls might believe it. The final video was dated July 19, 1990. It showed the girls in white robes standing in the chapel basement, the same chamber where their sleeping bags had been found. Bright spoke about their graduation to a higher level of service, about how they would now serve God in ways their earthly families could never understand. The girls' faces were blank empty of hope or resistance. They had been broken completely. Sarah couldn't watch anymore. She left the evidence room and found Rachel in the station lobby reading a newspaper story about the discovery. The headline read, "Disturbing find at former church camp raises questions about missing children. How bad is it going to get?" Rachel asked, without looking up from the paper. "Bad," Sarah said. "The videos confirm everything you told us. Worse, they show how systematic it was. This wasn't some spontaneous crime of opportunity. This was a carefully planned operation that used religion as camouflage." Rachel folded the newspaper slowly. "The worst part is how many people had to know," she said. "Camp counselors, church leaders, parents who asked too few questions. A crime this size doesn't happen in isolation." Sarah's phone rang with a call from Sheriff Martinez. "We got a problem," he said. "Margaret Henderson is here. She wants to know if we found her daughter Katie." Margaret Henderson was 73 years old, with white hair and hands that shook as she clutched a photograph of a smiling 12-year-old girl. She had been waiting in the lobby for 2 hours, refusing to leave until someone told her whether her daughter was among the victims. "Mrs. Henderson," Sarah said gently, sitting beside the woman. "We did find evidence that Katie was at the camp in July 1990. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Is she dead?" Sarah couldn't give her the answer she wanted because they still hadn't found bodies, but the evidence suggested the girls had been moved from the camp to other locations where their fate became uncertain. What she could tell Margaret was that Katie had been remembered, that her sleeping bag had been preserved with her belongings, and that someone had cared enough to document what happened to her. She showed Katie's diary, she said quietly. The last entry talks about how excited she was to be chosen for the special program. She wrote that she felt blessed to serve God in a new way. Margaret sobbed into her hands. "I sent her there because she was having trouble in school," she said. "The pastor said camp would help her find her way. I thought I was saving her soul, but I was sending her to hell," Mrs. Henderson Rachel said, appearing beside them. "My name is Rachel Morrison, and I was at the camp with Katie. She was brave and kind, and she never gave up hope. Even when things got very dark, she would whisper prayers for her family. She loved you very much." Margaret looked up at Rachel with desperate eyes. "Did you see what happened to her?" Rachel's voice was gentle but honest. Katie was selected for transfer to what they called an overseas mission. I don't know what happened after that, but I want you to know that she never stopped talking about coming home to you. As Margaret Henderson left the station with promises that they would continue searching for answers, Sarah realized that this case would destroy more than just the perpetrators. Every family who had trusted their children to Camp Galilee would now have to live with the knowledge that their faith had been weaponized against them. That evening, Sarah drove past the construction site where work had stopped indefinitely. The concrete chamber had been sealed again, pending further investigation, but she could still feel the weight of what lay beneath the ground. 14 sleeping bags arranged like offerings to a god who demanded innocence as sacrifice. Her phone buzzed with a text from David Bright. "I'm driving through the night," he wrote. "There are things about my father you need to know, things that go deeper than just Camp Galilee. This was bigger than anyone imagined." David Bright walked into the Clearwater County Sheriff's Station at 6 in the morning, looking like a man who had been carrying a corpse on his back for 34 years. He was 56 now, with grey hair and deep lines around his eyes, but Sarah could see the 22-year-old he had been in 1990 buried somewhere beneath the weight of his guilt. "I brought everything," he said, setting a cardboard box on the interview table. Financial records, correspondence with other camps, names of people who were involved. "I kept it all because I knew someday I would have to answer for what we did." Sarah sat across from him with Rachel beside her and a recording device between them. "Tell us about your father," she said. David stared at his hands. Thomas Bright was a charismatic man who could quote scripture like poetry and make people believe they were hearing the voice of God. But he was also a predator who used religion as a hunting ground. Camp Galilee wasn't his first operation, and it wasn't his last. He opened the box and pulled out a manila folder. "This is correspondence between my father and 6 other camp directors across 4 states. They called themselves the Sacred Shepherds Ministry. On the surface, they appeared to be independent religious retreats, but they were actually nodes in a trafficking network that moved children between locations depending on demand." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Demand from who? David's voice was barely above a whisper. "Wealthy men who paid for access to what my father called pure vessels, politicians, business leaders, even other clergy. They would request specific types of children, and my father would deliver them through the camp system. The girls who were selected for transfer weren't being sent to missions overseas, they were being sold." Rachel leaned forward, her face pale. "How many camps were involved?" David pulled out a map marked with red dots. 17 that I know of," he said. "My father was the coordinator for the Western region." The operation ran for almost 15 years before Camp Galilee was shut down, but the other camps continued operating under different names. Sarah studied the map, seeing dots scattered across states where hundreds of children might have disappeared into a system designed to erase them. Why did Camp Galilee close? Because of Rachel, David said, looking at the woman who had survived his father's crimes. "When she escaped from the van crash and started telling people what had happened, my father panicked. He shut down the camp and destroyed most of the records, but he kept the sleeping bags and videos as insurance, in case anyone in the network tried to betray him." "Insurance how?" Sarah asked. "If law enforcement ever got close to the other camps, my father could reveal the location of the chamber and prove that he had evidence against all of them. Mutually assured destruction, he called it. The sleeping bags were his guarantee that everyone would stay quiet." Rachel's voice was tight with anger. "So he preserved our belongings as leverage while our families spent 34 years not knowing if we were alive or dead." David nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "I helped him bury that chamber. I mixed the concrete and sealed those bags inside while telling myself that we were protecting the other children in the network. I was young and stupid and terrified of my father, but that doesn't excuse what I did." Sarah opened her notebook. "We need names. Everyone who was involved, everyone who knew." David pulled out a thick folder. "This is the client list," he said. "Men who paid for access to the children. Some are dead now, but others are still alive. Still in positions of power, still protected by wealth and influence." Sarah scanned the list and recognized names that made her blood run cold. A federal judge, 2 state senators, a police chief from a neighboring county. Men who had built their careers on public service while privately consuming the innocence of stolen children. How did payments work? She asked. Through shell companies and religious donations, David explained. The camps were registered as non-profits, so contributions were tax-deductible. Clients would make large donations and in return receive access to special retreat programs that included children who had been groomed for abuse. Rachel stood up abruptly and walked to the window. "I need air," she said. "Hearing the business details of how we were sold is making me sick." Sarah followed her outside where Rachel was leaning against the building, taking deep breaths. "You okay?" she asked. "No," Rachel said. "I'm not okay. I've spent 34 years trying to save other trafficking victims, but I never knew the full scope of what happened to us. Learning that we were part of some organized marketplace for child abuse is almost worse than the original trauma." Sarah put a hand on Rachel's shoulder. "We're going to get them. Everyone on that list, everyone who participated. We'll make sure they pay for what they did." Rachel looked at her with exhausted eyes. "The ones who are still alive might pay, but what about the hundreds of children who went through this system? What about the girls who never escaped like I did? They're gone, Sarah, and no amount of justice will bring them back." Inside the station, David was still talking to Sheriff Martinez about the locations of other camps and the methods used to transport children between them. The scope of the operation was staggering, involving fake missionary organizations, shell companies, and corrupt officials who provided protection in exchange for silence or participation. Sarah's phone rang with a call from the FBI. Agent Williams from the Crimes Against Children unit was driving down from Seattle with a team of specialists. The Camp Galilee case had just become a federal investigation into what appeared to be one of the largest child trafficking networks in U.S. history. As the day progressed, more families began arriving at the station. Parents who had sent their children to various camps over the years were starting to make connections. A mother from Oregon whose daughter had disappeared from a retreat in 1987. A father from Idaho whose son had never returned from a wilderness ministry program in 1992. Each family brought photographs and memories of children who had trusted the wrong people and paid with their lives. Sarah watched them gather in the station lobby, sharing stories of loss and beginning to understand that their individual tragedies were part of something much larger and more evil than they had ever imagined. By evening, the investigation had expanded to include multiple states and dozens of potential victim families. The concrete chamber beneath Camp Galilee had been just the beginning. Now they were looking at a network that had operated for decades, destroying lives while hiding behind the cross and the promise of salvation. Sarah sat in her office staring at the wall where she had pinned a map showing the locations of all known camps in the Sacred Shepherds network. 17 red dots representing 17 places where children had been stolen from their families and sold to monsters who collected innocents like trophies. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow, they would start the long process of seeking justice for victims who had been silenced by death or trauma. But tonight, Sarah allowed herself to grieve for her sister Jenny and for all the other children whose only crime had been trusting adults who wore the mask of godliness while serving something far more evil. 6 months after the sleeping bags were found, the FBI had arrested 12 men from David Bright's client list and shut down 3 camps that were still operating under the Sacred Shepherds network. But for every answer, they uncovered 10 more questions emerged about children who had vanished into a system designed to erase them completely. Sarah Chen stood in the empty chapel foundation at Camp Galilee, watching workers fill in the concrete chamber that had held 14 sleeping bags for 34 years. The site would become a memorial park with a small stone marker bearing the names of the girls who had trusted the wrong people and paid with their lives. It wasn't justice, but it was remembrance, and sometimes that was all the dead could hope for. Rachel Morrison had testified before a federal grand jury about her experiences at Camp Galilee, but the emotional cost had been devastating. She was taking a leave of absence from her work with trafficking survivors because reliving her own trauma had reopened wounds she thought had healed. Some scars Sarah had learned never fully disappear, they just learned to hide beneath the surface, waiting for the right trigger to split them open again. The Henderson family had finally been able to hold a funeral for Katie, even though her body was never found. Margaret Henderson had stood at the graveside, clutching a purple ribbon that matched the one in Katie's camp photo, and whispered prayers for a daughter who would never come home. The empty casket held Katie's diary and the friendship bracelet she had been making when her life was stolen from her. David Bright had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for his role in the trafficking operation, but his cooperation with investigators had helped identify dozens of victims across multiple states. He would spend the rest of his life knowing that his silence had allowed the network to operate for years after Camp Galilee was closed, destroying countless more families in the process. Sarah kept Jenny's diary on her desk at the sheriff's office, along with a photograph of 14 girls in white robes standing in a chapel basement. The photo served as a reminder that evil often wore the mask of righteousness and that the most dangerous predators were the ones who convinced their victims that abuse was actually salvation. The investigation had revealed connections between the Sacred Shepherds Network and similar operations in Canada and Mexico, suggesting that the trafficking of children through religious organizations was a problem that crossed international borders. The FBI estimated that over 300 children had been processed through the network during its 15-year operation, but less than 50 had been identified by name. Rachel called Sarah on a Tuesday morning in April to tell her that she was moving to Colorado to start a new practice specializing in religious trauma recovery. She had decided that the best way to honor the memory of the girls who didn't survive was to help other victims rebuild their lives after escaping similar situations. "I still have nightmares about Jenny," Rachel said during their final conversation. "I dream that we're all still in that chapel basement waiting for someone to rescue us. But then I wake up and remember that you found us. You brought us home, even if it was too late." Sarah drove to the memorial park on the anniversary of the discovery and found fresh flowers on the stone marker. 14 small bouquets, one for each girl, whose sleeping bag had been preserved in the concrete tomb. The flowers were different colors and types, suggesting that multiple people had visited to pay their respects to children they had never met but would never forget. She sat on a bench facing the marker and opened Jenny's diary to the last entry. "Today we start our real mission, for God," Jenny had written in her careful teenage handwriting. "I'm scared, but also excited because Reverend Bright says we've been chosen for something special. I hope Mom and Dad will be proud when they find out what important work I'm doing for the church." Sarah closed the diary and wiped tears from her cheeks. Jenny had died believing she was serving God when she was actually being fed to monsters who used scripture as camouflage for their appetites. The cruelest part wasn't just that she had been murdered, but that she had been convinced her murder was holy. The sun was setting behind the trees when Sarah finally stood to leave. As she walked back to her truck, she passed the construction site where luxury condos were rising from ground that had once hidden terrible secrets. The developers had chosen to build around the memorial park, creating a community where families would raise children in the shadow of a place where other children had been stolen. Sarah hoped the new residents would read the marker and remember that safety was never guaranteed, that predators often came disguised as protectors, and that the price of innocence was eternal vigilance. The sleeping bags were gone now, their contents catalogued as evidence in a case that would take years to fully prosecute, but their discovery had proven that some secrets refused to stay buried forever. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rachel, who was settling into her new life in Colorado. "I got a call today from a woman who escaped from a camp in Utah," she wrote. "She's been carrying her story alone for 20 years, but seeing the news about Camp Galilee gave her courage to speak. The truth is spreading, Sarah. The silence is breaking." Sarah smiled as she drove away from the memorial park. The 14 girls who had packed their sleeping bags for a week at summer camp would never come home, but their story was still being told still helping other victims find their voices, still proving that even the most carefully buried truth would eventually claw its way back to the surface. Evil had won for 34 years, but evil got the final word. That belonged to the survivors like Rachel, who refused to let the dead be forgotten, and the investigators like Sarah, who refused to let the living escape justice. Some battles took decades to fight, but they were worth fighting, because every child deserved to trust that the adults meant to protect them would actually keep them safe. The sleeping bags were empty now, but the memory of what they contained would ensure that 14 girls who went to summer camp to find God would never be lost again.